In this world, every interaction is a mirror, and often what we see in others is but a reflection of what remains hidden in ourselves. Now imagine a meeting between two forces, one that devours attention to fill a void, and one that sees through masks with quiet clarity. The narcissist thrives in performance, the super empath lives in presence. One manipulates emotion, the other embodies it. And in this dance there is no need for revenge or loud confrontation. The empath tortures the narcissist not with cruelty but with truth, not with rage but with stillness. You see, when a super empath sees through the illusion, they do not play along. They remain centered, rooted like a mountain in the storm. This silence, this refusal to feed the ego, it is the deepest cut. The narcissist needs fuel, but the empath no longer gives. Instead, they reflect. They hold up a mirror not to hurt, but to awaken. And this is agony for the one who cannot bear to look. The narcissist is disarmed not by war, but by peace. Not by vengeance, but by detachment. True power lies in awareness, and when the empath stops dancing to the narcissist's rhythm, they reclaim their own song. This is how the cycle breaks, not with noise, but with knowing. When an empath encounters a narcissist, the dynamic can appear lopsided at first glance. The narcissist, driven by an insatiable need to be seen, validated, and obeyed, often seeks emotional dominance through provocation, charm, or control. They craft situations designed to pull others into a dance of reactivity, to draw out pain, adoration, fear, or confusion. But the super empath does not immediately play that game. They sense the undercurrent, they feel the intention beneath the words, and so, rather than reacting, they begin to reflect. To reflect is not to mirror blindly. It is to become still enough to allow the narcissist to see their own behavior return to them, not amplified, not distorted, just revealed. The empath in this state becomes like still water, no waves, no echo, no confirmation of the narcissist's self-image. This absence of reaction is deeply unsettling to someone who thrives on chaos and emotional feedback. The narcissist relies on pulling strings and watching the puppet move. But when the strings no longer function, confusion sets in. Silence then becomes a tool of clarity. When the empath refuses to be drawn into the storm, they send an unspoken message. I see you, but I am not yours to move. This quiet awareness disarms the narcissist. They expect protest, they expect tears, resistance, admiration, or submission. But what they receive instead is neutrality, a mirror that does not react, a presence that does not tremble. And in this void, they are forced to face themselves. It is important to understand that this reflection is not cruel. The empath does not seek to punish, but to preserve. They do not reflect out of spite, but out of necessity. They know that reaction is the currency of control, and so they withhold it not to starve the narcissist, but to nourish themselves. This decision to remain reflective rather than reactive becomes a quiet revolution. It shifts the power without confrontation. It teaches without teaching. The narcissist may grow louder, more desperate. They may escalate their tactics, seeking to shatter the empath's stillness. But the super empath does not shatter easily. They are rooted in inner clarity, anchored by the knowledge that their peace is not a product of others' approval. They see through the illusion of control and realize that no one can truly pull you unless you offer the rope. This inner discipline, the refusal to react, is not passivity. It is a higher form of engagement. Reflection, in this sense, becomes both boundary and mirror. It defines where the empath ends and where the narcissist begins. It is the empath saying, your energy may move wildly, but mine does not need to follow. This is what makes the reflection so powerful. It invites self-examination without invitation. The narcissist begins to sense the emptiness of their performance, the futility of their manipulation, because it yields no emotional return. The true power of a super empath lies in their ability to hold space, even for darkness, without being consumed by it. This is not detachment in the cold sense, but in the wise sense. The empath sees suffering within the narcissist, but knows that healing cannot be forced or demanded. By offering no reactive energy, they allow the narcissist to experience the weight of their own actions, perhaps for the first time. The mirror does not punish, it simply reveals. Thus, the empath, through reflection, becomes not a victim but a catalyst. Not a target but a teacher, though the lesson may be uninvited. The narcissist, stripped of their usual tools, is left with only themselves. And in that moment the torture begins not through violence or vengeance, but through the unbearable weight of unacknowledged truth. The narcissist is an actor on a grand stage, constantly performing for an imagined audience. Every word, every gesture, every charm-laced smile is calculated not to express authenticity, but to secure control, admiration, or pity. Their identity shifts according to what the scene demands. They are chameleons, experts at adapting their colors to match the environment, but rarely revealing the true skin beneath. This constant performance is not a choice, but a survival mechanism rooted in deep insecurity. And yet, when faced with someone who is fully present, this performance begins to unravel. The super empath carries something the narcissist cannot fabricate: authenticity. They do not need to impress or manipulate. Their power lies in their presence, grounded, aware, and alive in the current moment. They do not shift masks or characters to fit into spaces. Instead, they inhabit themselves fully, creating a quiet yet undeniable contrast to the narcissist's illusion. This presence becomes a mirror not of flattery, but of reality, and that reality becomes unbearable for one whose sense of self is hollow. Being present is not a passive state. It requires deep inner work, the ability to be still within chaos, to observe without absorbing, and to listen without losing oneself. The empath's presence says, "I am here, but I do not need to play your game." It is a kind of silent rebellion, a refusal to be swept into drama, distortion, or emotional theatrics. And this refusal becomes deeply unsettling to someone who depends on reactions to feel real. Performance craves validation, but presence is its own reward. The empath does not seek applause. They do not posture. Their strength is not loud, but it is firm, like a tree that does not chase the wind, yet bends when necessary. This quiet stability exposes the frantic, ever-changing nature of the narcissist. While the narcissist may try to pull attention, twist narratives, or provoke emotional highs and lows, the empath remains centered, unmoved, not because they do not feel, but because they choose not to abandon themselves in the chaos. This difference in orientation, one inward, one outward, becomes the axis around which the entire dynamic turns. The narcissist may become louder, more erratic, trying to break the stillness that reflects their own dissonance. But the empath's presence is not designed to protect the narcissist from discomfort. It simply refuses to participate in the falsehood. It is the quiet, still candle in a room full of flashing lights. It does not compete, it just is, and that being is what disarms the narcissist most. In the company of someone who is truly present, the narcissist feels something unfamiliar: transparency. Their tactics lose effectiveness, their stories fall flat, their masks begin to slip, not because they were torn away, but because there is no longer an audience willing to believe the illusion. The empath does not challenge the mask, they simply don't acknowledge it. And this is perhaps the most devastating response of all: no reaction, no correction, just clear, calm observation. Presence also carries something else, a kind of purity that sees without judgment. The empath does not need to expose the narcissist, they only need to remain themselves. And that is enough, because presence forces the narcissist into confrontation with a truth they have long evaded, that identity, love, and meaning cannot be manufactured. They must be lived, and living requires more than performing, it requires being. So the narcissist begins to feel invisible, even as they try to shine brighter. They are no longer the center of the stage. The empath is not watching them perform, nor clapping, nor crying. Instead, the empath's presence becomes the only real thing in the room, and in that realness, everything false begins to fall away. There is a silence that is passive, an absence of words born from fear or uncertainty, but there is another kind of silence, cultivated through discipline, wisdom, and inner mastery. This silence is not empty. It is full of awareness, of intent, of understanding. When a super empath meets a narcissist, this silence becomes their shield, their boundary, and their message. It speaks without volume, and yet it speaks louder than any shouted truth. The narcissist feeds on noise, verbal battles, emotional outbursts, constant attention. It doesn't matter whether it's praise or conflict. All forms of engagement are fuel. Noise confirms existence. Reaction confirms control. But silence is something they cannot grasp, because it offers nothing to hold on to. It is the absence of drama, the void where manipulation finds no footing. It is like trying to swim in still air. There is no traction, no resistance to push against. When the super empath becomes silent, it is not because they have nothing to say. On the contrary, they see everything. They feel deeply, but they choose stillness as their response. In that stillness, they claim sovereignty over their energy. The narcissist may provoke, poke, perform, seeking a rise, a breakdown, any evidence that their presence still matters. But the empath offers none, and that lack of emotional return becomes a mirror far more painful than any insult could ever be. Silence is not withdrawal, it is presence without performance. It is the empath standing in their truth without needing to explain it. There are no justifications, no counterattacks, only quiet recognition. The narcissist expects to be chased when they retreat, applauded when they return, forgiven before they ask. But the empath's silence offers no such rhythm. It breaks the cycle. It says, I see, and I do not need to respond. And that detachment wounds deeper than any confrontation. This kind of silence unnerves the narcissist because it creates space where their illusion cannot survive. In noise, their lies are protected. In confusion, their mask holds. But in silence, they are left with themselves. And that solitude, that mirror, like void, begins to show them something they have long avoided, their own emptiness. The empath's silence becomes a teacher, not by intention but by design, for in stillness truth reveals itself without force. There is power in not defending oneself. There is strength in letting the narcissist's words hang in the air unanswered, like arrows that find no target. The empath understands that responding often validates the tactic, but silence starves the strategy. It renders manipulation ineffective, and over time, this becomes unbearable to someone who relies on others to reflect their significance. Silence also nurtures the empath. It gives them space to listen inwardly, to remain aligned with their own truth rather than be pulled into reactive spirals. It is how they protect their peace. The narcissist who expects the world to orbit around their chaos cannot understand this kind of inner sanctum. They press harder, get louder, and yet the empath only becomes more still. And in this stillness, the narcissist begins to lose control, not of the empath, but of themselves. So the power of silence becomes a paradox. It is non-action that takes action. It is non-reaction that causes reaction. And it is this quiet defiance, this peaceful refusal to engage, that becomes the most powerful statement the empath ever makes. One that says, "I choose peace over performance. I choose myself over your need for control." And the narcissist, who once thrived on noise, begins to crumble in the echo of that silence. To see clearly is a gift, but to feel clearly without becoming entangled is a discipline. This is the power the super empath carries, the ability to experience emotion deeply while still discerning where the emotion comes from, who it belongs to, and what its purpose is. In the presence of a narcissist, this clarity becomes a compass, keeping the empath from being pulled into confusion, projection, or guilt. While the narcissist weaves narratives, bends truths, and cloaks manipulation in sentiment, the empath remains rooted in emotional reality. The narcissist thrives in emotional distortion. They may express exaggerated pain to gain sympathy, anger to intimidate, or affection to disarm. Their emotions are not expressions of inner truth, but tools to control. In this landscape, most people become lost, second, guessing themselves, unsure of what is real. But the super empath has learned to separate signal from noise. They recognize when a feeling is genuine and when it is engineered. This inner filtration system protects them from being swept into the narcissist's constructed emotional storms. Emotional clarity does not mean detachment from feeling, quite the opposite. It means feeling with accuracy. The empath may sense the narcissist's hidden shame, their unspoken fear, their fragile ego beneath the mask. But they do not confuse that insight with responsibility. They do not take ownership of what they did not cause. They do not internalize the blame that is projected onto them. This clarity becomes a shield, invisible, yet impenetrable. When the narcissist tries to provoke guilt or obligation, the empath pauses. They listen to their own body, their breath, their intuition. They ask themselves, "Is this mine?" And more often than not, the answer is no. This small question, simple yet powerful, becomes a guiding light through the narcissist's fog. It brings the empath back to themselves, back to truth, and prevents them from reacting out of conditioned roles like fixer, savior, or scapegoat. The narcissist often confuses drama with depth. They believe that intensity equals connection, that manipulation equals intimacy. But the empath sees through this. They understand that real connection is steady, not volatile. It is mutual, not extracted. And so, when they sense the emotional chaos being used as a smokescreen, they step back, they observe. They feel, but they do not follow. This ability to feel without fusing is what protects them from being consumed. It is a painful clarity at times, because the empath may see the wounded child inside the narcissist, the unmet needs, the lifelong hunger for validation. But they also see the pattern, the cycle of harm, the refusal to take responsibility, the endless need to dominate emotionally. And they know that compassion does not mean compliance. Emotional clarity allows them to hold space for understanding, without sacrificing their boundaries in the process. The narcissist may accuse the empath of being cold, unloving, or distant, but these accusations are projections, attempts to guilt the empath back into servitude. Yet the empath has seen this pattern before. They recognize the tactic, and because they see it, it no longer controls them. The empath's calm response, their lack of emotional entanglement, becomes infuriating to the narcissist who expects drama as proof of love. Instead, the empath offers truth, unshaken, unmasked, and untethered. So the empath moves through the interaction like water, flowing around the manipulation, not absorbing it. They no longer need to explain themselves because they trust their emotional compass. They no longer fear being misunderstood because their clarity is internal. And this clear seeing, this clean, unwavering perception becomes unbearable for the narcissist, whose entire existence is built on illusion and confusion. The relationship between a narcissist and a super empath often begins like a magnet. One craves devotion, the other offers depth. One seeks admiration, the other gives understanding. In the early stages, this dynamic may appear complementary, even fated. But beneath the surface, something far more dangerous begins to unfold, a cycle of emotional extraction. The narcissist tests boundaries, then rewards submission. They alternate charm with punishment, praise with punishment, in an effort to create emotional dependency. And for a time it may work until the empath awakens. The super empath does not awaken in anger, they awaken in awareness. At first it may come as a quiet discomfort, a sense that something is off, though nothing specific has been said. Then it becomes a pattern, words that don't match actions, apologies that carry no change, affection that feels conditional. And slowly the empath begins to trace the cycle. Idealization, devaluation, and discard, repeated over and over. But awareness is the first thread that unravels the entire web. Once the empath sees the cycle, they begin to shift. What once felt like loyalty now feels like self-abandonment. What once felt like love begins to resemble control. And in that realization, the entire illusion begins to crack. The narcissist, sensing the shift, may try to tighten their grip. They may return to love bombing, offering hollow promises and manufactured vulnerability. But the empath, now clear-eyed, is no longer moved by theatrics. They no longer confuse intensity with intimacy. Breaking the cycle is not loud, it is not dramatic. It is a quiet turning inward. The empath begins to ask, what parts of me agreed to this? What wounds was I trying to heal by staying? These are not questions of blame, but of liberation. In answering them, the empath reclaims their power. They stop trying to change the narcissist and start choosing themselves. And in doing so, the cycle begins to fracture from within. The narcissist may accuse the empath of changing, of becoming cold or distant. But this is only because their old tools no longer work. The guilt, the flattery, the rage, none of it penetrates anymore. The empath does not react, they respond. And their response is measured, minimal, and non-negotiable. It is not about revenge, it is about release. The dance has ended, and the empath simply stops showing up to the performance. Breaking the cycle often comes with grief, not just for the relationship, but for the version of self that tolerated it. The empath mourns the time spent, the love given, the truth denied. But in that mourning there is also rebirth, a rediscovery of their voice, their rhythm, their worth. And this is what the narcissist cannot bear, not the loss of the empath, but the loss of control. The realization that their script is no longer being read. Cycles require repetition to survive, but the empath no longer provides the emotional response that fuels the repetition. They no longer explain, defend, or engage. They leave messages unanswered, accusations unmet, provocations ignored. Not out of spite, but out of peace. It is a peace earned through clarity and suffering, and one they now protect fiercely. So the cycle, once fed by emotional highs and lows, begins to starve. It shrinks, it weakens, and eventually it breaks not with a scream, but with a whisper. A whisper that says, I see you, I forgive you, and I am finished. Compassion is often misunderstood. To many it looks like endless giving, relentless understanding, and an open heart without condition. And for the super empath, compassion flows naturally. It is not something they do, but something they are. They see pain where others see anger. They hear the cry behind the cruelty. Their instinct is not to judge, but to hold. Yet this very gift becomes a doorway through which the narcissist often enters, not to be healed, but to feed. The narcissist interprets compassion as weakness, not because they understand it, but because they cannot access it. To them, vulnerability is a resource to exploit, not a space to honor. And so, when the empath forgives without demand, listens without interruption, and stays when most would walk away, the narcissist does not respond with gratitude. They escalate, they push, they test, not to see how much love exists, but to see how much control they can gain. But there comes a moment when the empath sees this clearly and everything changes. True compassion, the kind that is powerful, the kind that is wise, is not without boundaries. It does not say, "I will carry your pain at the expense of my own." It says, "I will witness your pain, but I will not be consumed by it." This shift is subtle but seismic. It is the moment when the empath realizes that loving someone does not mean losing oneself. And in that moment, they begin to build the boundary not of stone, but of self-respect. The boundary is not a wall. It is not a punishment, it is a declaration. This is who I am, this is what I allow, this is where I end and you begin. And in the presence of a narcissist, this clarity is unbearable, for the narcissist cannot control what they cannot access. They cannot manipulate what they cannot guilt, and so they may call the empath selfish, uncaring, cold. But the empath, now anchored in truth, does not flinch, because their compassion has matured. It is no longer bleeding. It is breathing. There is a kind of grace in this balance, the ability to hold space for someone's humanity while also holding space for your own. The empath learns not to rescue, but to witness, not to absorb, but to observe, and most importantly, not to betray their own needs in the name of being good. For what is goodness if it costs you your wholeness? This question becomes a compass, guiding the empath away from martyrdom and into maturity. The narcissist, who once thrived on the empath's blurred lines, now finds only edges, soft but firm. The empath no longer explains the boundary. They embody it. They do not argue for their right to peace. They simply live it. And in doing so, they become inaccessible to the chaos. The narcissist may react with confusion, even rage, as the usual doors remain closed. But the empath does not open them again, not out of bitterness, but out of balance. This is the quiet revolution of the empath, to love without losing themselves, to care without being consumed, to offer warmth without forfeiting safety, and in this, compassion becomes a disciplined art. It becomes a conscious act, not a compulsive reaction. The empath no longer says yes because they fear rejection. They say yes when it aligns with truth, and this discernment, this inner authority, is what truly separates love from sacrifice. So, the narcissist, once confident in their ability to return at will, now finds a boundary they cannot cross. Not because they are hated, but because they are no longer needed. The empath's compassion remains intact, untainted, whole. But now it is protected, now it is sovereign. And for the narcissist, who once drank endlessly from that well, there is nothing more unsettling than the realization that the well now flows only for the worthy. There is a subtle theft that takes place in the presence of a narcissist, not of possessions, but of energy. The super empath, generous by nature, gives freely, time, attention, presence, emotion. But what begins as conscious giving often becomes unconscious draining. The narcissist thrives on this flow, tapping into the empath's attention like a hidden pipeline. Whether through praise or conflict, they find ways to keep the empath's focus fixed on them. And the empath, accustomed to nurturing others, may not notice how much of themselves is slowly being siphoned away. Energy is life force, not just physical stamina, but mental clarity, emotional resilience, and spiritual alignment. It is what allows us to move with intention, to create, to discern, to rest. When the empath begins to feel tired without cause, foggy in thought, or emotionally depleted after even brief interactions, they are not just tired, they are being drained. The narcissist's tactics, though often covert, are designed to feed off emotional investment. They provoke just enough to stay relevant, to ensure the empath never fully detaches. But there comes a moment when the empath becomes still enough to notice. They begin to trace the pattern, how they feel energized when alone, and drained when the narcissist reappears. They notice how even silence from the narcissist can create anxiety, the withdrawal that demands pursuit. And in that recognition, the empath begins the sacred work of reclamation. They no longer give away energy unconsciously. They become intentional with their attention, careful with their presence, and discerning with their emotional responses. Energy reclamation begins with awareness, but it continues through discipline. The empath learns to stop responding to every message, every provocation, every emotional hook. They redirect their focus inward, where once their energy was outwardly scattered, always tending, always managing, always rescuing. Now it begins to consolidate. Breath becomes deeper, mind becomes clearer, and the soul, once stretched thin, begins to feel whole again. This is not selfishness. This is survival with wisdom. The narcissist senses this withdrawal not just as distance, but as defiance. The energy they once consumed so freely is no longer accessible. The empath, no longer entangled in emotional bait, becomes unpredictable, and unpredictability unnerves the narcissist, who relies on consistent reactions to maintain control. But the empath offers none, no rise, no chase, no explanation. Just a steady presence that flows only where it is welcomed, honored, and reciprocated. Reclaiming energy is not about withholding love, it is about reclaiming choice. The empath still feels deeply, but they choose where their energy goes. They understand that not everyone is entitled to their attention. Just because someone demands does not mean they deserve. This shift, though invisible on the outside, is transformational on the inside. The empath, once fragmented, begins to return to themselves in pieces, every moment of peace, a piece returned. The more the empath reconnects with their own energy, the more they remember who they are without the narcissist's influence. Their creativity returns, their inner voice grows louder. They begin to act not in response to others, but in alignment with self. The external noise loses its grip, and the narcissist, now deprived of the energy that once sustained their illusion of power, begins to collapse under the weight of their own emptiness. But the empath does not look back. They are busy rising. This is the quiet power of energy reclamation. No grand gestures, no dramatic exits, just a gradual, graceful return to self. The empath learns that their energy is sacred, that their time, their emotion, their presence is not a currency to be spent on the unworthy. And as they continue to gather the pieces they once gave away, they become something the narcissist can no longer reach, whole, self-sustaining, and free. There is a kind of power that cannot be seen, only sensed, a stillness that does not react, a presence that no longer bends. This is what the super-empath becomes after the storm, untouchable, not in the way of arrogance or cold detachment, but in the deeper, quieter way that comes from deep integration. After enduring the narcissist cycles, surviving the emotional warfare, and reclaiming all that was theirs, the empath no longer fears being misunderstood or unloved. They no longer live for external validation. They live in truth. To become untouchable is not to become invincible. Pain still exists, emotion still moves, but none of it sticks. The empath now recognizes that not every insult requires a defense, not every attack deserves a response. Silence becomes the sword, detachment becomes the shield. The narcissist, once adept at provoking emotional chaos, now finds their strategies ineffective. The empath does not play the game anymore, not because they cannot, but because they have outgrown it. There is something unsettling to the narcissist about a person who will not be baited. Their control depends on reaction, the outrage, the explaining, the begging, the tears. But the empath offers none of these now. They may look into the eyes of the narcissist with calm, with clarity, with unshakable presence, and in that gaze the narcissist sees something unfamiliar, a mirror that does not distort, but reflects back the truth they've spent their life avoiding. The empath, now untethered from roles like rescuer, fixer, or caretaker, walks with a different rhythm. They speak only when they choose. They no longer feel the need to explain their worth or justify their boundaries. Their no is a full sentence. Their yes is offered with integrity. And their energy is no longer an open door, but a guarded gate, one that only opens for those who come with respect, reciprocity, and sincerity. What makes them untouchable is not bitterness, but healing. They do not hate the narcissist. They do not seek revenge. Their indifference is not the absence of feeling, but the presence of discernment. They have processed the pain, felt the loss, seen the pattern, and they have emerged from it, not hardened, but whole. And wholeness is what makes them unreachable to those who once fed on their fragmentation. The narcissist may attempt one final act, the hoover, the plea, the gill, tridden apology wrapped in nostalgia and need. But the empath, now sovereign, sees it for what it is. The hooks no longer hold. The spell is broken. What once pulled them in now passes through them. They do not meet manipulation with anger. They meet it with stillness, and in that stillness they become untouchable. To be untouchable is to return fully to oneself, to no longer be defined by someone else's perception, needs, or chaos. The empath now carries a quiet certainty, a knowing that does not need to be defended. Their power is not in loud declarations or dramatic exits, but in their refusal to engage where their soul is not honored. This absence of emotional availability to dysfunction is not a void. It is a boundary filled with light. And so the narcissist, who once believed they could always return, always reset the game, finds only a closed gate and a clear silence. The empath is gone, not just in distance, but in vibration. They have risen beyond reach, not by force, but by frequency. And though the narcissist may never fully understand what they lost, the empath knows what they gained themselves, untouched and untouchable. So in the end, there is no revenge, no punishment, no outward battle. The super empath tortures the narcissist not through cruelty, but through elevation. By no longer reacting, no longer chasing, no longer needing, they create the deepest rupture of all, absence. A presence that once gave endlessly now gives to itself, and in that shift, the narcissist is left alone with the very thing they've spent a lifetime avoiding themselves. What once seemed like weakness was never weakness at all. It was love, it was depth, it was the ability to feel, to connect, to heal. The empath simply turned that ability inward. They became their own sanctuary, their own mirror, their own answer. And from that place they rise steady, silent, free, no longer needing to be understood, no longer desperate to be seen. They become invisible to those who only seek to consume. They do not close themselves off to the world. They simply close the door to harm. And in that final, graceful withdrawal, the empath completes the transformation, not from victim to fighter, but from seeker to sovereign, untouchable, whole, and finally home.